Hi, my name's Nathan, and welcome to Hardshell History. Here at Hardshell History, we'll be venturing off the beaten path of time, exploring forgotten moments of the past, exploring exciting and forgotten technologies, and delving into some of the finer details of well-known historic events. Regular uploads will begin in 2027, but since this is our nation's 250th anniversary, we couldn't resist sharing just one video with you now. So without further ado, please sit back and enjoy our pilot episode, Creating the National Anthem. If you're watching this video, then there's a good chance you're an American. And if you are, then hopefully you know that our national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner, was written by a man named Francis Scott Key during the War of 1812. And if you didn't know, well now you do. The exact details of how the United States ended up at war with the British in 1812 is out of the scope of this video. But for now, all you really need to know is that Francis Scott Key was a lawyer and sometimes poet who, through some curious circumstances that we're going to get into, ended up on a small boat in Chesapeake Bay on a cool September evening in 1814. Now, under ordinary circumstances, it might have been a nice way to spend the evening, but Key was a prisoner of the British Navy, and they were currently launching a 25-hour-long bombardment of the fortification that protected the city of Baltimore, Fort McHenry. The dramatic scene of explosions overhead, fire glistening off the water of the bay, and the roar of cannons both near and far so moved Key that he began writing what would become the Star Spangled Banner that very night, during the battle. And so, in this video, in honor of our nation's 250th birthday, we are going to conduct a historic analysis of the national anthem. We'll talk about the context behind some of the lyrics, look at the other three stanzas that we don't sing at football games, and we'll give a brief biography of Francis Scott Key, and look at the night and the battle that influenced him to write the Star Spangled Banner. We'll also throw in some fun facts, look at some myths, and we'll close out by looking at one of the most iconic symbols of the anthem, the flag. So, first things first. Let's look at some of the lyrics of the Star Spangled Banner and see what they're really all about. That line, "The rocket's red glare," is one of the most iconic lines in the national anthem. The long, drawn-out melisma that singers put on that last word can give you chills. It is awe-inspiring. But let's back up. What is Key actually talking about here? What rockets and what red glare? This is the War of 1812. We aren't launching drones or missiles. The German V-2 won't be invented for another 128 years. So Key isn't talking about literal rockets here, right? Well, actually, yeah, he is. Specifically, they were Congreve rockets, fired from specially modified British warships. They were named after their inventor, Sir William Congreve, and in 1814, these were still a pretty new technology. There was actually 3 different sizes, based all on weight, and they would see a lot of use during the Napoleonic Wars. On land, soldiers would be launching these rockets from earthen ramps or movable tripods, but at the Siege of Fort McHenry, these are being launched from special British warships. The HMS Erebus, in particular, is launching these from below deck, where it has 10 portholes cut in either side of the ship. And I mean, just imagine this. Imagine you're a British sailor during the siege. You are firing these rockets from underneath the deck on a wooden boat. At night, it has to be smoky, cloudy, fiery, absolute chaos. The noise must have been unimaginable. Now, like I mentioned before, there was 3 sizes of rockets, but there's also a few different types. You had incendiary, or fire-starting, explosive for knocking down buildings and walls, and shrapnel for anti-personnel use. Some of these even had separate fuses for controlling if they're going to explode in the air or on impact. The rockets fired on Fort McHenry were 3.5-inch diameter, 32-pounder Congreve rockets. Here you can see an example of one that was recovered after the battle. Now, at first glance, it might not look too impressive. It's just a rolled-up tube of iron, kind of like a stovepipe. But in the early 19th century, these things had to be absolutely terrifying to see. They are flying through the air with a long tail of fire and sparks behind them, and they are exploding into flames whenever they hit something. In fact, terror was kind of the name of the game with these things. Now, don't get me wrong, they could absolutely be deadly, but against the thick walls of Fort McHenry, they were probably some of the least effective weapons that the British used that night. On top of causing minimal damage, Congreve rockets were notoriously inaccurate. They relied on large-scale volleys, not precision fire. And even though hundreds of them were fired at the fort, a lot of them ended up just landing in the water. But, despite their minimal influence on the battle itself, they had a profound effect on Francis Scott Key. It was the continual volleys of Congreve rockets and naval mortars that told Key throughout the long night of the battle that the fort had not surrendered. That is to say, that through the night, the flag was still there. But, like I said, if anything was going to put an end to Fort McHenry, it was not going to be the rockets. It was going to be the mortars. These things were behemoths. Mounted on the decks of British warships, the super heavy ordnance could fire 10 or 13-inch cast iron balls packed with gunpowder. So the smallest ones were just a little bit bigger than a basketball, and they could be launched over 2 miles. Just imagine the force behind that. And to make matters worse for Fort McHenry, the American cannons only had a range of about 1.5 miles, which meant the British could pummel the fort without being in any real danger themselves. With that context in mind, you can really hear the tension in the line, "Oh say, does that Star Spangled Banner yet wave?" It isn't a casual question. The fate of the entire nation rested on that question. Imagine the joy Francis Scott Key must have felt when he finally saw the sun illuminate that flag. The sight was so moving that it had inspired him to start writing what would become the Star Spangled Banner right there on the boat. Now, like I mentioned before, there was actually 4 stanzas originally. Today we only sing the first one. So what happened to the other 3 and what were they about? Well, let's read through it together, and for your sake I won't sing it. On the shore, dimly seen through the midst of the deep. So you could picture that morning fog rolling in, where the foe's haughty host in dread silence reposes. So the mighty British, they've been pummeling the fort hours before, and now they just float quietly in the bay, all their efforts in vain. What is that which the breeze o'er the towering steep, as it fitfully blows, half conceals, half discloses? Now it catches the gleam of the morning's first beam. In full glory, reflected now shines in the stream. Now I have to imagine some jubilation building up here. The breeze comes over the water, it tugs on the edge of that massive flag, drawing it out into the morning light. "'Tis the Star Spangled Banner, oh long may it wave, o'er the land of the free, and the home of the brave." All right, let's go on to the next stanza. "And where is that band who so vauntingly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion, a home and a country should leave us no more?" And I kind of wish this was still included in the anthem today, because it's basically just a jab at the British, right? You know, you acted all tough, you talked a big game, where are you now? Their blood has washed out their foul footsteps' pollution. No refuge could save the hireling and the slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. And the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph doth wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. So Key takes a more serious turn here. Nothing can save you from retreat or death. Absolutely no one is safe. He says that the blood of the British have wiped away their very footprints off of American soil. It sounds harsh, and it is. Remember that this is all taking place less than a month after the British burned down the White House, they raided Washington, D.C., and they chased out James Madison and the rest of the president's staff. But let's close this out and take a look at the 4th stanza. "Oh, thus it be forever, when free men shall stand between their loved home and war's desolation. Blessed with victory and peace, may the heaven-rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us as a nation. Then conquer we must, when our cause is just, and this be our motto, in God is our trust. And the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph shall wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave." So in this final stanza, we have Key give God the glory for the victory, And this is actually where we derive the motto, "In God We Trust," which was first added onto coins during the Civil War and then became the national motto in 1956. And I will bet you didn't know that one, that Francis Scott Key gave us not only our national anthem, but also our national motto. And speaking of Key, who was he? How did he find himself with a front row seat to one of the most consequential battles in our country's history, and watching from the British lines no less? Key was born in 1779 in Frederick County, Maryland, about halfway through the Revolutionary War. His father, John Ross Key, was a soldier in the Continental Army, and after the war he would go on to be a judge and a justice of the peace. Following in his father's footsteps, Key would become an attorney before enlisting in the DC militia in the War of 1812. He would serve as a lieutenant in a light field artillery company and serve as an aide to General Walter Smith in the Battle of Bladensburg just a few weeks before the siege at Fort McHenry. In September of 1814, Key was chosen to act as a negotiator in a prisoner swap with the British. The prisoner that the Americans wanted was a 65-year-old man named Dr. William Beans. While he wasn't an outright supporter of the British, Dr. Beans had allowed the British to use his own home as a local headquarters. But after DC was burned and the British withdrew, the doctor was put in an awkward situation. Some soldiers that were lingering behind were getting drunk, harassing the townspeople, and kind of just being a general nuisance to the neighborhood of Upper Marlborough. A group of locals, including Dr. Bean, eventually arrested these soldiers, but the British saw this as a betrayal. Had the doctor not, out of the kindness of his heart, let the British stay there previously, it probably wouldn't have been such a big deal. But the British now saw this as an act of treason. For a while, it seemed pretty likely that he would actually be hung, or at least imprisoned, which, at that time and in those conditions, and with his advanced age, probably also meant he would die. Friends of the doctor soon reached out to Francis Scott Key to help negotiate a release. Key's experience as a prominent attorney, his time in the military, and an acquaintanceship with the doctor all made him an ideal candidate. On September 5th, 1814, just 12 days after the British had burned down the White House, Francis Scott Key and his friend, John Stuart Skinner, boarded a small boat under a flag of truce and sailed up the Potomac towards the Chesapeake Bay, where the British were now anchored near Baltimore. It took the pair about 2 days to actually find the fleet, but on the 7th they eventually boarded the 80-gun flagship, the HMS Tonon. Once on board, Key and Skinner met with British Vice Admiral Alexander Cochrane, who was in charge of naval forces, and British Major General Robert Ross, who was in charge of the land forces. The two men presented their case as to why the doctor should be released, and presented a stack of letters written by wounded British soldiers that stated that Dr. Bean had cared for them even after the Battle of Bladensburg and the burning of the White House. The British commanders seemed genuinely moved by these letters, and they actually arranged for Dr. Bean to be released. But unfortunately for Francis Scott Key and John Skinner, their ordeal was not over. After securing Bean's release, the pair of negotiators were invited for a formal dinner in the Admiral's cabin. The room would have been lined with fine mahogany panels, the table set with silverware and fine china, and dinner would have been served with glasses of wine. Sadly, history does not record exactly what was served for supper that night, but we do know what happened next. After dinner, in what had to be a pretty awkward moment, Key and Skinner were informed that the British were preparing an attack on the military linchpin of Fort McHenry, and that they would be kept as prisoners until the attack was concluded. Now, Key and Skinner had to have known that the British were planning an attack of some kind, otherwise they wouldn't have been in Chesapeake Bay, but they had no way to know that they had interrupted the British just 5 days before the attack was set to go off. The small vessel that the men had come in on was tied to another ship and towed behind the fleet, while Key and Skinner were transported to the HMS Surprise and held as prisoner for the next 4 days. During this time, the fleet moved ever closer to Baltimore until the 12th, when the two Americans were moved back onto their own boat, but under the guard of Royal Marines. Their boat would be moored just 8 miles away from Fort McHenry, and they would have more or less a completely unobstructed view of the entire battle. The battle began on September 13th at 6:30 in the morning, and would go on almost continuously for 25 hours through an endless bout of rain. Key watched the bombardment, having had almost no outside information about the war for the past 4 days. Throughout that gray stormy day, and into the night, the only reason that the men knew that the fort hadn't surrendered was because the British kept firing. There was a prolonged moment of terror for the men, however, around 1 a.m. when the guns fell silent. For Key and Skinner, The law was terrifying because it meant that the fort might have surrendered. But in fact, the pause was taken so 1,200 British troops could make landfall and try to seize the fort in a raid. Fortunately for the garrison at Fort McHenry, sentries at the much smaller Fort Covington down the peninsula spotted the British approaching in their rowboats, and were able to decimate the British Marines with volleys of cannon fire. The British had no choice but to return to their ships, and the bombardment resumed at 3 in the morning. For Key and Skinner, it was a key indication that the battle was not lost. From 3 a.m. onwards, Key watched anxiously, just barely getting glimpses of the flag illuminated by exploding shellfire, until finally, by the dawn's early light, Francis Scott Key could see the American flag, the stars and stripes, waving over the battered walls of Fort McHenry. Not long after, the British finally gave up their assault and began to withdraw around 9 a.m. Key and Skinner would not be released to go home until the 16th of September, however. When they were finally allowed to go, the pair set sail straight for Baltimore. Upon his arrival back, Key immediately went to the Indian Queen Hotel and began writing out what would become the Star Spangled Banner. The general framework of he'd probably already begun writing while watching the bombardment from his boat. Now in this next part, we're going to look at some myths that have cropped up around the anthem, but also take a look at some facts that we often overlook. First up for the myths is a classic one, and that is the Star Spangled Banner was originally a drinking song. Now this one is kind of half myth and half truth, because it is true that the tune that Key set the lyrics to was already around at that time, but to call it a drinking song is a bit of an exaggeration. The original tune came from a British song titled To Anacreon in Heaven. It was a club song, but don't think of it like a pub. Think of it more like a high society social club with fancy suits, ruffled collars, and glasses of sherry. The patrons of the club probably did sing it while toasting, but it was a lot less rowdy than a traditional drinking song. Our second myth is an inspiring and patriotic story, but when we look at the facts, you realize it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And that is the legend that the flagpole at Fort McHenry was held up with dead bodies. According to the story, at some point during the battle, a British shell hit the flagpole, but some brave patriots ran up and held it in place. Soon enough, though, they were killed and more men took their place. This happened again and again and again until there was such a pile of bodies that the flag was standing upright, held in place by nothing but patriot corpses. It is an inspiring story, but it doesn't make any sense. First off, there's no record that the flagpole was ever hit by any kind of projectile. The bombardment was incredibly intense, but Fort McHenry is huge. The flagpole was definitely a big flagpole, but even then the base of it was only about 2 feet across, and in the grand scheme of the entire fort, that's not a whole lot of area. And even if the pole had been broken, it's very unlikely that a handful of soldiers would have been able to hold it upright. That pole was more than 80 feet tall and weighed well over 1,000 pounds. It would be like trying to hold up an entire pine tree. And as far as the part about holding up the flagpole with bodies, you'd need an entire company's worth of bodies to hold that thing up. And only 4 Americans were actually killed during the bombardment. And myth number 3. The fort was a civilian fort, or at least there was a lot of civilians sheltering in the fort during the battle. Kinda like the flagpole story, this just doesn't really make a lot of sense. When the city of Baltimore learned that the British were coming, they were absolutely terrified, but the fort was probably the last place you'd want to go. I mean, just think about it. That's the first place the British are going to attack. In reality, people that wanted to leave just left the city. But most actually stayed and watched the battle from their rooftops. Now what is true is that the British launched attacks all up and down Chesapeake Bay, and in towns like Washington, D.C. or Havre de Grace, civilian homes were absolutely destroyed or looted. In fact, because Baltimore was a hub for privateers, which were basically pirates with the government's permission to go after British ships, the British had a special disdain for Baltimore, calling it a nest of pirates. And they made it clear that if they had the opportunity, they would burn the city to the ground. Fortunately, Fort McHenry held and the city was saved. So those are some of the myths. But what are the facts? What exactly happened during one of the most famous battles in American history? Let's take a look at 3 of my personal favorite facts about the battle. Fact 1. The fort came that close to being destroyed. If you ever have the chance to visit Fort McHenry in Baltimore, you'll realize just how solid of a building the fort really is. The ramparts, or outer walls, are made up of brick, and they are several feet thick. And then on top of that, you have another layer of soil, which is also several feet thick. All in all, the structure could just absorb shot after shot after shot like a sponge. The soldiers and buildings inside the fort were more vulnerable, of course, but the actual outer walls were pretty much indestructible. There was an Achilles heel, however. It was a soft spot that pretty much every fortification of the era had: the powder magazine. The magazine is what gave places like Fort McHenry their teeth. The reason the fort worked was because it could reliably damage ships that entered the harbor, but it could only do that with large and powerful cannons. The powder for these cannons was kept in wooden barrels in the fort's powder magazine. Typically, the powder magazine was the most well-defended part of the entire fort. Typically located near the center of the fort, the walls and the roof were several feet thick, and the whole structure was buried under several feet of earth. But at Fort McHenry, the powder magazine had not been finished yet. All that protected more than 300 barrels of gunpowder was a simple roof of brick and wood. Everyone knew it was risky, especially the fort's commander, Major George Armistead, but the defenders didn't have the time or the resources to complete the roof of the powder magazine before the British attacked. And this flaw was very nearly the end of the fort and its garrison when, about 8 hours into the bombardment, a British 186-pound mortar crashed through the roof of the magazine, and then nothing. The round that almost certainly would have detonated the powder magazine, killed most of the garrison, and ended the battle with a British victory, failed to detonate. The reason for the failure isn't exactly clear. The rain could have snuffed out the mortar's fuse, or the round could have just been a dud. Either way, Major Armistead recognized how close the fort had come to disaster, and he ordered his men to begin moving the gunpowder out of the magazine and then stacking the barrels in different locations around the fort. This increased the odds that one of the stockpiles would be hit, but ensured that not all the powder would be lost in a single strike. Also, the explosion from a single, much smaller stockpile would be less devastating to the fort and the garrison. Fact number 2. The siege at Fort McHenry was a decisive battle. Most battles in most wars are just stepping stones to victory or defeat. It's rare for an entire war, or at least a major part of a war, to hinge on a single dramatic battle. But it does happen. What happened at Fort McHenry is one such example, though. If the fort fell by the British landing an assault force, or by the powder magazine exploding, or by any other means, then the city of Baltimore would have almost certainly fallen. Without the fort, the British ships could shell the city indiscriminately, and they'd already been very vocal about their plans to burn the city to the ground. So if Baltimore did fall, what would happen next? Well, it's a little hard to say, but the United States was in pretty dire straits. The Madison administration was in hiding after the burning of the White House, the nation had almost no money, and some of the northern states were actually talking about secession. The Treaty of Ghent, which would end the war, was already being hashed out at this point, but if Baltimore fell, the United States would have lost a lot of leverage. Talks were in the works to strengthen Great Britain's power in the Great Lakes region, and to establish a Native American buffer state in North America. It's unlikely that the United States would have reverted back to an English colony, or lost its independence, but if Fort McHenry fell, then the U.S. that emerged probably would have been a lot smaller and a lot weaker. At the most extreme, the United States could have fractured into 2 or 3 much smaller countries. And of course, if the British had taken Fort McHenry, the national anthem as we know it today would not exist. Fact 3. Francis Scott Key was initially opposed to the War of 1812. Even though he would eventually serve in an artillery unit and as a negotiator, Key felt at the start that the United States had rushed too hastily into war. He was especially opposed to America's planned invasion of Canada, which rather than a strategic war move, he viewed as an unjustified land grab. He even went as far as calling the war a lump of wickedness, a motif which was probably inspired by his faith as a devout Episcopalian. His views shifted, however, after the British actually landed troops along Chesapeake Bay, and Key witnessed the destruction and the pillaging firsthand. Now, for the final part of this video, I just want to briefly look at the icon that inspired the anthem and that continues to symbolize not just our nation, not just the people of the nation, but the actual ideals that the United States was founded on. The flag. The first thing that I want you to know is that the flag that Key saw when he wrote the national anthem is still around today. You can go and see it for free pretty much anytime you want at the Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. And I can tell you personally that if you're an American, going to see it is a very moving experience. And if you do go see it, you'll probably be surprised by just how big this flag is. Originally, it was 30 feet high and 42 feet long. It was intentionally made that size so that the British could see it from miles away. Each star is 2 feet across, and it's all pieced together with more than 1,000 feet of hand stitching. The maker of the flag, Mary Pickersgill, sewed the entire thing in her house with the help of her daughter, 3 nieces, and an indentured servant, all in just 6 weeks. The flag is a little bit smaller now because, being over 200 years old, it suffered a lot of wear and tear. The flag is a little smaller now because, being over 200 years old, it suffered a lot of wear and tear. Pieces have been cut off for souvenirs, it's got patches here and there, but all things considered, it's held up remarkably well. But after the shock of seeing the size of the flag, the next thing you might notice is that it has 15 stripes instead of 13. See, Congress initially decided that a new star and stripe should be added for each new state, but they pretty quickly realized that that would be impractical. So by 1818, they determined to keep the stripes at just 13 for the original 13 colonies, and to only increase the stars. It's also important to remember that there was actually 2 flags flown during the Battle of Fort McHenry. The grand 30 by 42 foot flag that you see at the Smithsonian was indeed flown over the fort and was seen by Francis Scott Key, but it wasn't actually raised and unfurled as a formal sign of victory until the British stopped firing. For most of the actual bombardment, a smaller storm flag was being flown. While still large at about 17 by 25 feet, the storm flag was a lot smaller than the grand victory flag. The main reason for this was because of the endless rain. See, flags at the time were mostly made of wool, and if the grand garrison flag had gotten soaked with rainwater, it would have been so heavy that the sheer weight of it could have broken the flagpole. Because of that, the actual victory flag wasn't raised until about 9 a.m., when the fort's band played Yankee Doodle, and while Francis Scott Key planned out the lyrics to the Star Spangled Banner. And this brings me to something that I think a lot of people outside the United States, and even some people within the United States, have trouble understanding. That's America's seeming fixation on the flag and the national anthem. In many countries, the flag is symbolic of the country itself, or maybe even just the current state of a country. But within the United States, the flag is not a representation of just the geographic area that we call the United States. It doesn't just represent the 50 states, or the culture of America, or even the people of America. In the United States, the flag specifically represents the ideals of liberty, democracy, and freedom. The flag, and by extension the national anthem, represents the foundational principles of this nation, even when this nation fails to live up to those ideals. That's why burning the flag is so offensive to many Americans. Burning the flag isn't just seen as a protest against a particular action of the United States, or even a protest against the United States itself. Instead, it is, in the minds of many Americans, a protest against the very idea of a democratic republic, a protest against the idea that all men are created equal, and a protest against liberty itself. That's why if you ever go to Fort McHenry and watch the short video in the visitor center, which ends with a recording of the national anthem, the audience is going to stand up without being prompted or asked to. Men will remove their hats out of respect, and individuals in the crowd will independently begin singing. Every time that video plays, a curtain rises to reveal a window showing an American flag flying over Fort McHenry. People around you will start to cry. Every time. People will literally shed tears. Not because of the literal piece of fabric that's fluttering in the breeze outside, but because of the ideals that that fabric represents. If you ever go to see the original flag on display at the Smithsonian in D.C., it too is a deeply emotional experience. I personally have shed tears walking through that exhibit. There is a palpable but almost indescribable swelling of emotion, a mix of hope, joy, solemnity that wells up in you when you are so directly connected to the raw ideas and emotions that have inspired the form of governance that America pioneered and that the rest of the free world now strives for. America is not the only liberal democracy, not the only democratic republic, but it is the forerunner. And the symbols of this nation are representative of those principles and ideals. And with that, I hope you've enjoyed our video. God bless you, God bless the United States of America, and happy 250.